Bonjour and welcome back to the World History course. I am your professor, Philippe Girard. We just spent the last 3 lectures looking at the many ways in which the Mongols changed the medieval world, whether it's war, commerce, diplomacy, or disease. Today we're going to leave the Mongols aside for a bit and head to Japan to study how their society functioned in medieval times. Fair warning, the Mongols might pop up unannounced anyway. That's just the way that they operated. Normally, you should have already watched the lecture on feudal France, the one on the High Middle Ages, and the lecture on Confucianism in section 2. If not, do so now, because medieval Japan was remarkably similar to medieval Europe and imperial China in many ways, so you need to understand one system to draw comparisons with the other. So, medieval Japan today. It was a very hierarchical society, so let's start from the top with the rulers of Japan known as the emperors of Japan, specifically the Yamato Dynasty. And just to be clear, a dynasty refers to a line of kings, or emperors who come from the same family. Normally in most countries, dynasties come and go. There's always a moment when they run out of heirs, or they get overthrown by rivals, and the family line comes to an end. We talked about the Merovingian dynasty, the Carolingians, and the Capetians in France. Or next time we'll talk about the Song and the Yuan and the Ming dynasties in China. But what's remarkable about the imperial rulers of Japan is that they all come from the same family, the Yamato dynasty, which has proved unusually long-lasting. For well over 1,000 years, the Yamatos have been able to produce sons and to remain in power through a bevy of civil wars and foreign invasions, which is really remarkable. I mean, after World War II, it was unthinkable to keep a Nazi in power in Germany, but the Emperor of Japan, even though he was also responsible for some pretty awful war crimes in China, somehow managed to convince the US to keep his throne. Just one potential little glitch: the current emperor married late and only has a daughter, so there's some debate in Japan as to whether the crown should go to a more distant male relative or, gasp, to a daughter for the first time in history. So the dynasty might have to take a little detour, but I'm sure they'll find a way to survive, like always. Notice that I was a bit vague about how far back the dynasty goes. I said, well, over 1,000 years, and there's a reason for that. The Yamato emperors are first mentioned in religious texts from the 700s AD. And by religious, I mean Shinto texts. Shintoism is a polytheistic religion that is really unique to Japan, where it coexists with the Buddhist religion. Among other things, the Shinto religion regards the emperor of Japan as divine. So as a historian, you have to be skeptical about religious texts written about emperors who are also supposed to be divine in that religion. So anyway, here's the story of the Yamato dynasty as told by the Shinto tradition. That story begins with the Shinto goddess of the sun, Amaterasu, who one day decided to hide inside a cave. And that was a major problem, because if the sun is hiding, then it would be perpetual night on Earth. So to entice her out of the cave, her fellow gods decided to hang 2 objects from a nearby tree, a jewel and a mirror. This way the young lady would be tempted to go out of the cave to see what that beautiful jewel was about. And then she would notice a mirror and spend a minute or 2 looking at herself and fixing her hair or something. And if you're a woman who's offended that the story dwells on tired female stereotypes, well, that's to be expected. Traditional Japan was quite sexist. So that's the story we got. Don't shoot the messenger. At any rate, Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun, she spent enough time out of the cave that the other gods were able to sneak up on her, grab her, and prevent her from returning to the cave. Crisis averted. And that's why the sun is still rising every morning. According to the Shinto tradition, that same goddess of the sun, Amaterasu, is the one who sent her grandson to rule Japan in the 7th century BC, before Christ. And this is why I describe the Yamato emperors as divine. They are supposed to be direct descendants of the goddess of the sun. And that also explains the Japanese flag. This is a country of the rising sun, far to the east, ruled by descendants of Amaterasu. The jewel and the mirror subsequently became part of the imperial Regalia. Regalia, that's the word that comes from the Latin rex, which means king. So the Regalia would be the symbols used by a king. In Europe, typically it's a crown or a scepter with the hand of justice, Or if you've ever been to London, you might have gone to the Tower of London to see the Regalia of the British Crown. But in Japan, the Regalia consists of a jewel and a mirror, which are quote-unquote proof that the emperors descend from the goddess Amaterasu. Back to the story I just told you. There's a third element to the Regalia, a sword, which has a story of its own. The brother of Amaterasu once fought a fierce dragon with 8 tails and heads, and then, after killing that dragon, found the sword inside one of the tails. He gave that sword to his sister, Amaterasu, who gave it to the Yamato emperors. And so, as centuries passed, each Japanese emperor was presented with those 3 items during his coronation as proof that he was a rightful emperor and descendant of a god. One of these emperors had copies made for fear that the originals might be lost, and they're just copies, but they acquired some authority of their own. Think of them as the authentic replicas, even though that would be an oxymoron. In fact, the regalia, the crown, the jewel, the sword, and the mirror, all these would be so important that just having the items in your hands, that was enough to make you the rightful emperor. I'll give you some examples. In the 1180s, various members of the Yamato family fought each other in a major civil war. And after one naval defeat, one family member plunged into the sea with the jewel and the replica sword so that the rivals would lack legitimacy even after winning the battle. And then a replica was made of the replica sword, and people fought over the replica of the replica instead. In another civil war in the 1330s, family members again fought over who owned the regalia, all the replicas, or which replicas were authentic and which ones were not legit. I'll stop here, you get the point. These 3 items are crucial because they remind everyone that the emperors of Japan are of divine ancestry. Nowadays, some of the items are kept in the capital, Tokyo, and others in various shrines in Ise and Nagoya further west. And there's a big fear of losing the items that have survived the various civil wars over the course of history, so the regalia is now kept away from the public and even from the emperor himself. They're just ceremonially presented to him inside boxes on the day of his coronation and then taken away for safekeeping. And if you're curious about what the regalia actually looks like, I know I am, here's a picture I was able to find on the internet of what the sword, the jewel, and the mirror are supposed to look like. A little digression. I was lucky enough to visit Japan when I was 18, including the temple of Ise, where one of the items is kept. And that temple was supposed to be centuries old, but it looked suspiciously new to me. Remember rule number 1 about being a good historian, always double check the information you're given, critical thinking, that's key. And as it turned out, after I dug up the matter a bit, the temple of Ise as an institution may be ancient, but the physical temple, the building itself, that was destroyed every generation, every 25 years or so, as part of a religious ritual. Meanwhile, they built a new temple nearby, and when it's ready, they destroy the old temple and they start the cycle again. And that's supposed to be part of a Japanese willingness to discard the past and start from scratch. Supposedly, that helped them recover faster when the country was ravaged by US bombing during World War II. Speaking of critical thinking, what do you make of the whole sun goddess ancestry of Japanese emperors? Do those Japanese emperors really go back to the 700s BC and a goddess and a dragon? I know I have my doubts. Well, there's a rival theory based on the fact that the tombs of early Japanese emperors resemble those of Korean kings. So possibly the first Japanese emperor was not a god from the 700s BC, but a Korean warrior who came on a horseback somewhere around the 700s AD and then made up a whole story about divine ancestry to justify his rule. Japanese people tend to be self-centered and even xenophobic, especially towards Koreans, so they absolutely hate that theory. But personally, it makes far more sense to me than a tale about some goddess in a cave playing with a mirror. Here's what we do know for sure. By the 700s AD, there were Japanese emperors who had managed to unify the whole country under their rule, and their first permanent capital was located in the city of Nara, and then was moved to the nearby city of Kyoto in 894, and there the capital remained until 1868 when it was moved to the present-day capital of Tokyo. As I said earlier, Japan was ravaged by US bombing in World War II, including Tokyo, but Nara and Kyoto somehow emerged relatively unscathed. So there are still some gorgeous Shinto and Buddhist temples in those two towns, the old imperial capitals of Japan, that date back all the way to the 700s and 800s. Well, almost. If you ask some pesky questions, as I did as a teenager, you'll learn that many of these temples were actually destroyed by fires or earthquakes at some point in their history and then rebuilt. But they're still really old and beautiful. My personal favorite is Kinkaku-ji, the Golden Pavilion, a Buddhist temple in Kyoto. It's gorgeous whether you see it in the spring when the cherry trees blossom, or when the temple shimmers under the summer sun, or when it's framed by the autumn leaves, or when it's adorned by winter snows. Always beautiful. By the way, do you remember the story I told you about the Greek temple of Ephesus in Turkey when we covered the lecture on Alexander the Great? How one nondescript Greek citizen was so eager to become a hero that he burnt down the temple of Ephesus, one of the wonders of the ancient world, so that he would be remembered for something, anything, even something terrible like arson. Well, the same thing happened with the Golden Pavilion of Kinkaku-ji in Kyoto. A novice monk burnt it down in 1950. So what you saw on those photos, that's a fairly modern reconstruction. If you're interested in that story of the crazy monk in Kyoto, I really recommend that you read the novel Golden Pavilion by Yukio Mishima, which is based on that story, that tragedy. I can't read Japanese, but even in translation, Mishima has a short, precise prose that is really elegant and evocative. And it's a great story about my favorite Japanese temple. So read that. Well, I've been doing a lot of digressions today, so my main point here for that slide is that by the 700s, Japanese emperors, supposedly of divine ancestry, lived in a permanent capital, first in Nara and then in Kyoto. Now that I've told you about the origins of the imperial line of Japan, goddess of the sun, Korean invader, let's look at the social structure of Japan in the Middle Ages. It bears some remarkable similarities to what we studied regarding medieval France. Just like in France, professionals came to dominate the field of warfare. You might call them nobles or knights in a European context. In Japan, they were called the samurai. Again, like in France, the title of noble became hereditary, and a big gap developed between civilians, such as, say, rice farmers in Japan, and the nobility above. The samurai had long hair, they had 2 swords, they demanded respect from commoners, and the Japanese language has super complicated rules about politeness. The samurai also cultivated martial virtues, indifference to pain or death, and unfailing loyalty to their overlords. And the word samurai actually means those who serve. So serving as warriors, that was the very essence of what it meant to be a samurai. And just like in France, the nobles, the samurai, fought all the time. In the 1100s in particular, there were vicious civil wars between 2 families, the Taira and the Minamoto. And that included the famous Genpei War of the 1180s. And the Minamoto clan prevailed in that civil war, after which the Minamoto leader took on the title of Shogun, which means the top general. And he gave that title to his son, and so on. And so the Minamoto shoguns became a dynasty of their own. What about the Yamato emperors then? Well, they remain in office, but more as figureheads from now on. They were of divine ancestry according to Shinto myths. They belonged to an ancient line, they owned the official Regalia, so they were officially at the top of the pyramid. But the real power, both political and military, that was wielded by the person immediately under them, the shogun. And that system remained the norm under various dynasties of shoguns until the Meiji era in 1868. I do have a video on the changes that took place after that in the modern half of the World History Survey, if you want to check it out. So, emperor at the top, then below that, the shogun, who wielded effective day-to-day power, kind of like the Queen of England and the Prime Minister today. And then below those 2, the daimyos. These were regional rulers with castles of their own army, and so forth. And in theory, those daimyos owed obedience to the shogun and to the emperor, but they were quite autonomous on a day-to-day basis. One step below again, the famous samurai, the warriors. Their role was to serve their daimyos and to fight. And to make sure that they stayed in their place, they were bound by a specific code of honor known as the Bushido, the way of the warrior. And that code emphasized loyalty, honor, courage, and respect. Anyone who broke that code of conduct was so dishonored that he was expected to commit seppuku, which means suicide, as a way to save face. Some samurai even killed themselves when their master died, even if they had done nothing wrong, just because their whole purpose in life had been to serve a master, so they preferred to die with him than to live on their own. That was called junchi, suicide, which means to follow somebody in this. Yet another digression, if I may, but this one is important. Suicide is a major problem among young people. Just 2 semesters ago, there was a wave of suicide at the institution where I teach. So I don't want you to think, oh, the samurai had a point, suicide is a great way to solve my problems in a face-saving way. It's not. Not everything that people did in history was good. In fact, we've seen ancient people do a lot of stupid things, like slavery or child sacrifice. So here's my 2 cents. If you have a problem in your life, face it head on, and if it's overwhelming, just ask for help from family members, teachers, or medical professionals, but do not throw away your whole life because your boyfriend dumped you or whatever problem ails you at the moment. Believe me, we're not worth it. I have been through a lot of life crises over the years. They hurt a lot, but ultimately every problem was solved, and there were sunny days after the rainy ones. So don't fantasize about Japan's suicide forest. Back to the samurai. Their code of honor, the Bushido, was based on tradition. Because samurai just learned stories from their favorite ancestors, especially those who fought in the Genpei War, and they tried to live up to their example. And as a result, preserving the records of your ancestors, your family histories, and honoring those ancestors by following in their footsteps, that was almost a religious duty. And samurai were passionate about their family history. In fact, even in the middle of a battle, they would start screaming the story of their glorious ancestors for all to hear, and then wait for a samurai of similar lineage to tell the story of his ancestors, and then they could fight as equals. And in time, those stories of great warriors were collected and put into writing in a book called the Agakure, which is like the Bible and Bushido, the rule of the warriors. If you're interested in the world of samurai, I recommend watching the movies of Akira Kurosawa, that legendary Japanese filmmaker. His movie, Seven Samurai, that's a classic, the most famous of his movies, but I personally prefer another one of his samurai movies, Rashomon, because of the way it introduces alternate viewpoints in the script, which is basically what I do every day as a historian. So add it to your Netflix list as well. Seven Samurai and Rashomon. And Hidden Castle too. And Ran. But anyway, finally, as you go down the social pyramid of medieval Japan, which is what we were studying, you will find the commoners, rice farmers, artisans, and merchants, in that order. In other words, the vast bulk of the Japanese population and 0% of the political and military power, and especially when they were female. Now, I like to pause in my videos every once in a while to give you a chance to weigh in, instead of just soaking in whatever I tell you in a passive way. Remember the Socratic method. So ask yourself 2 questions. 1, how does the Japanese social pyramid compare to feudal France, which we studied in section 3? And 2, how does it compare to the society of Confucian China, which we studied in section 2? Go ahead. Pause the video for a sec and think about it. It might be easier if you just take a piece of paper and list the 3 social orders side by side. Well, let's start with France. Remember how feudalism started from the top with a king who commanded a lot of respect because he belonged to an ancient dynasty and because of his association with the Catholic Church, monarchy by divine right, and how that king did not have a lot of effective power compared with some of his vassals? Well, they're very similar to the Japanese emperor. No shogun in France, so that would be a major difference. So let's go straight to the vassals of the French king, like the Duke of Normandy, who would be the direct equivalent to the Japanese daimyos. They too had their own castles, their own armies, their own judicial systems. Very similar. Then you have the French knights, who are the direct equivalent of the samurai, down to the concept of chivalry, a code of honor similar to Bushido in Japan, except for the suicide part. and then at the bottom of the French medieval order, this third estate, the peasants who worked, paid taxes, and obeyed, just like in Japan with rice farmers. So overall, very similar, even though the two countries were far apart geographically. And it's fascinating how both France and Japan responded to the same problem, endemic warfare in the feudal era, with a similar solution, a decentralized feudal system based on an interlocking web of mutual loyalties, honor, and obedience. Now, what about Confucian China? Well, there too you had an emperor at the top and a very top-down system based on loyalty and obedience. Again, notice the similarity with Japan. The respect for family and tradition, the cult of ancestors, the scorn for women and the young, all that is straight from the Confucian playbook. Notice also how in Japan, craftsmen and especially merchants were considered inferior to farmers. Well, that's also derived from the Confucian dislike of non-producers. So a lot of similarities which are not a coincidence. Japan and China are close by geographically, and because China is such a cultural behemoth in East Asia, Japan has inherited many traditions from China. Buddhism, for example, was introduced into Japan through China. Or the Japanese writing system called the kanji, which is exactly like Chinese characters, except that the words are pronounced differently. That's also from China. And then Confucianism, based on the teachings of a Chinese philosopher, that was also very influential in nearby Japan. The one major difference between the two social pyramids that we just saw is that in China, soldiers and war in general were seen as destructive and bad. Whereas in Japan, professional warriors occupied a prominent spot in society, starting with the shogun. So very different in that regard. And I guess the nobility of Japan just picked and chose what they found convenient about the Confucian system and tacked on their own warlike culture to the basic Confucian framework. That feudal structure of Japan from the emperor on down was the main thing that I wanted you to learn today, but I can't escape the opportunity to bring in the Mongols one more time and tie to this lecture to the rest of the section. Remember Kublai Khan? He was that grandson of Genghis Khan who became leader of China during the Mongol Dynasty, the Yuan, also the one who met Marco Polo. Well, among his various achievements, he wanted to expand the Mongol Empire even more by conquering Japan. And on paper, that was a mismatch, the mighty Mongol Empire versus puny Japan. But there was a small problem of crossing the sea to get there, though the Mongols, traditionally a horse-riding culture, could draw from the knowledge of the Koreans and the Chinese in terms of shipbuilding. Remember how the Mongols were always adept at using their foreign subjects for technical roles. So in 1274, a massive Mongol fleet set sail from Korea. 900 ships, 40,000 men. They did encounter some resistance after they landed in Japan, so they went back to their ship for the night, and just then, as if by miracle, a massive storm hit the Mongol fleet and 300 of the ships went down. And Japan remained independent. But Kublai Khan would not quit. So the Mongols, using the resources of China at this time, came back in 1281 with an even larger fleet. 4,500 ships, 150,000 men, which basically corresponds to the size of the Allied fleet on D-Day in 1944. Again, a lot of resistance on land by the samurai, and so the Mongols had to remain on their ships while trying to overcome Japanese resistance on shore. After a while, another storm hit, the Mongol fleet was ravaged, as if by miracle, and Japan remained independent yet again. Those two storms were probably just a coincidence. After all, there are a lot of typhoons in the Pacific. Naval archaeologists have even been able to locate the wreck of that second fleet, and apparently the ships were hastily built and not always of top quality, which would explain why they sank so easily. But the Mongols and the Japanese, they drew different lessons from these two fortuitous disasters. They thought that obviously the gods were protecting Japan, that those storms became known as kamikaze, which means divine wind. The term kamikaze should sound familiar to you. Much later, towards the end of World War II, in 1945, Japan was on the verge of being invaded again, but this time by a US fleet, not a Mongol fleet. And you know what Japan did next. It unleashed hundreds of suicide pilots who were willing to put their life on the line to protect the emperor, just like the old samurai of yore. As it turned out, the divine wind of suicide pilots was not enough to win World War II, and Japan was occupied by foreign US troops for the first time in its history. Or second time if the story about the Korean origins of the Yamato imperial line are true. Well, that's history for you. A story about Japanese suicide pilots in World War II is based on another story about Mongol invasions in the 1200s, and an even older story of samurai honor and devotion to the emperor. It's all connected. That's why we learn history, to understand the origins of the world around us. Well, that's it for today. If you want to learn more, read that book by Yukio Mishima, watch a Kurosawa movie, and then tune in for the last lecture of this section, which will take us back to China, right when the Mongol Dynasty ended. Au revoir, and see you next time.